right, we're now going to talk about the second part of evolution, and in so we're going to bring up natural selection. And when we talk about natural selection, there's a particular word that comes to mind, and that word is fitness. Now, some biologists say that fitness is measured in grandchildren. And basically what they mean by that is that where fertility is the ability to produce offspring, fitness is what we would consider the ability to produce grandchildren. Now, what biologists are basically implying there is, or what they're talking about is, when a species is able to produce grandchildren, obviously it's referring that species is finding a way to survive. In other words, it's being fit to survive based on the dangers of the environment, based on health, based on finding food, based on predation, protection, all those kinds of things. And it's living long enough where it can survive, and also long enough where its offspring will have offspring of their own. So think about this for a second. We're talking about a species surviving. We're talking about a species surviving long enough to have offspring, and then continuing to survive to the point where their offspring will have offspring of their own. So that's basically where fitness is defined as the ability to produce grandchildren. Now, in natural selection, the word fitness is very big. Give me 1 second. Fitness is big because fitness comes from a coin phrase that Darwin came up with. Now, Darwin in the mid-1800s took a voyage around the world, and he studied several thousands of different species of plant and animal. And Darwin set up on doing the majority of his study on the Galapagos Islands, and he wrote a book about that. But his voyage was basically to a study on his theory of evolution. And his theory of evolution is basically how life has changed over time. And if you take this one particular species and you see how it has changed over time, and you do the same thing for another species, he has found links between the two species if you go back in time to see where they came from. And he's found links between various species, which we refer to as common ancestors. Common ancestors means species A and species B both evolved from a species C, let's say. So they both came from that. He developed his hypothesis that today we call his theory of evolution. In 1959, Darwin wrote that book called On the Origin of Species, where he basically talks about evolution taking place over millions of years. And in that, he comes up with his component of this called natural selection. He also calls natural selection, survival of the fittest. He came up with this phrase, survival of the fittest, that whenever you talk about natural selection, you think of survival of the fittest. And basically what that means is any species, any individual organism that has characteristics that allow it to survive better in their environment, they are basically demonstrating survival of the fittest. When certain organisms do not have these characteristics, then they're not the fittest. And so if they aren't the fittest, chances are they probably won't survive as well, or they won't survive as often, or even long enough to produce enough offspring of their own as well. They won't be able to reproduce successfully. And this is what Darwin called survival of the fittest, also known as natural selection. Now, Darwin basically we can summarize natural selection into these four major components. First, there's overproduction. You have to have in other words, for natural selection to occur, to take place, you basically have these four components take place in their own. It starts off with overproduction. And in overproduction, you have more individuals than the environment can take on. And the environment taking on a number of organisms just basically means this is the amount of food that there is, this is the amount of shelter that there is, these are the conditions that exist for this environment, and then based on those three major components and probably quite a few others, a number is going to come about. And basically that means that's basically about the number of organisms that would be able to survive in that environment. So what would happen if the organisms, if the species go over that number, if they populate over? Let's say, for example, for a particular environment, let's say we're talking about the Everglades. And let's say, to speak in very round numbers, that the Everglades has enough fish, trees, water, in other words, food and shelter for 100 alligators to survive. Obviously it's more than that, but again, just speaking in a round number. Let's say that the Everglades could sustain normally 100 alligators. Now let's say that the alligators started to overpopulate, and within a year or two span, that number 100, let's say the number 100 stayed at about 100 for, let's say, 100 years. And now all of a sudden, something has happened where the alligators are reproducing more. And now instead of 100 in the Everglades, there are 150. Would there be enough food and shelter for 150? No, there wouldn't. So you would have an overproduction, you would have overpopulation. Now in that overpopulation, before the negative starts to come about, you would also create a genetic variation, the second component. And in that genetic variation, well, let's stay with the alligator. Some alligators are darker, some are lighter, some are smaller, some are larger, some have, faster, slower, and so forth. And so with that, now you get a genetic variation. You're going to get variances in size, variances in color, things like that. So when that happens, well, the light ones could reproduce with other light ones, and they could also reproduce with other dark ones. The small ones could reproduce with other small ones, and they could reproduce with other large ones. You're going to get a variation. And so the population from what it was originally is going to start to change. You're going to get some that are basically better adapted to the environment. If for this alligator, being dark was better than being light, because it meant you could hide in the greener trees, or you were less seen by fish underwater, things like that, eventually the lighter colored alligators would cease to survive, because they wouldn't be able to catch as many fish and be able to hunt as well as any of the other animals. So little by little, there would be what Darwin considered a struggle to survive. Now once this struggle to survive basically kind of balances out, then you have your fourth step, you have your differential reproduction. And basically you're left with the strong ones. The weakened ones have now died off, and so you're left with the strong ones. And then those strong ones, and by strong ones I want to clarify that by strong ones I mean the ones that kept the more favorable traits. Going back to the alligator, if being darker than lighter, the color of their skin was a favorable condition for the Everglades, then the lighter ones have now died off, the darker ones have now stayed behind. And then in differential reproduction, now when they have offspring, all of those offspring will be darker colored as well. And so the organisms with the favorable characteristic will continue, and they will pass it on to their offspring. So the characteristic itself will become more frequent in the population. In other words, far and few of the lighter colored alligators would exist anymore, and all of them would eventually become darker. So again, just to kind of recap this again, Darwin's theory starts out with the overproduction of offspring, where the organism is going to produce more offspring than what the environment can hold. And then in there, you're going to have an inherited variation. When you start to get your population numbers up, you're going to have variances. Remember, think of a dog. A dog has puppies, and some of them are small, some of them are large, some of them are this color, some of them are that color. And so when those puppies start to reproduce with puppies of another litter, then you have even a different color. Let's say, for example, you got this one puppy that has a litter of puppies that are black and white. Then you have in another house 2 other dogs. They reproduce. The female has puppies, and she has puppies that are gray and tan. You mix those gray and tan with those black and white, and you're going to start to create a different shade of gray, a different shade of tan, a different shade of black, a different shade of white, and so forth. And you're going to have that inherited variation, okay? We call that recombination. It's called recombination, okay? Most of this variation is determined by genetic inheritance. That's what we call recombination. It's just basically thinking about it as a mutation. Remember, not all mutations have to be bad. Some mutations can actually be good. So in the case of, let's say, for example, coloring, some of these giraffe will survive better, and they develop these colors because of their environment. It allows them to survive better for whatever it is that they are going to do in their environment. Any organism, even plants will do the same, will basically create this recombination to become more fit and adapt to your environment. Now, when that happens, what happens with the weaker ones? What happens with the ones where they don't have the characteristic that is better? Now you have your struggle to survive. So here's really that part where survival of the fittest kind of comes in. This is the part where we really think about survival of the fittest. Things like predation, things like coloration and so forth. Here's where if you're fit, it's because you're able to survive, have offspring, and continue to live long enough where your offspring will eventually live long enough and have offspring of their own. Okay? Now there are also some other things the things that we don't see that can also determine fitness in a species. Like, for example, immune system. Immune system is something that you don't typically see like color, but that's also something that can be passed on and does play a big role in that struggle to survive as well. The animals that genetically speaking pass on better immune systems to their offspring will automatically have a better chance to survive, even though they don't have the coloration or the size or speed or the physical characteristics that we generally think about as well. And then, again, finally leading toward the end. When the weak have died off and the fit have survived, they're going to continue to pass on those advantageous traits to their offspring, where the ones with the disadvantage in their characteristics will no longer be around or won't be around in such high numbers. In that change, when we're talking about natural selection and survival of the fittest, we're talking about taking an animal, or an organism, we're talking about taking an organism and having it over the course of time, having it change. so that it can adapt to its environment. That is also one of the other things that Darwin studied and was able to prove as well. He called that descent with modification. So here you have, let's say for example in this picture here, you have this one finch. Remember, Darwin spent a vast majority of his years on Galapagos, particularly studying the finch more than anything else. And he noticed that he noticed that all these various types of finch all had one common ancestor. Here you have the original species of finch that's now extinct. And basically the big thing we're talking about here is the beak. Because on Galapagos, the beak is what's going to let you survive, because it's the one thing that allows you to feed here. And if you notice all the different types, and when you get a chance, you read what it is that they used to eat and so forth, these birds became better adapted to their environment. And if you notice, what does it take to go from this beak to this beak? You're obviously talking about a lot of changes. And it takes sometimes millions of years, sometimes as little as, thousands of years, never less than that. But these modifications do occur. Darwin basically knew that this is not something that could happen overnight. So his theory of evolution basically tells us that evolution has been taking place for millions of years. Okay? Then we question, well, what evidence did Darwin actually show to prove this? Well, Darwin developed a lot of his theories based on fossil records. Darwin saw that fossil records, you took an animal, you studied the rock that was right beside this animal or buried in the same rock sample or layer of the earth with a particular rock. Needless to say, you could date the animal that way. Or the organism, I'm sorry, I keep saying animal. We're talking about plants as well. That you could date the organism that way. You could find out the date of when this thing existed. So fossil records would be a good indicator, a really good indicator of being able to see evolution take place. It tells us how the course of the planet has changed and how the course of these organisms have changed, what they basically could have come from. We find that common ancestor. Again, still dealing with the common ancestor, we also have geographic distribution. Now here we're talking about finding that one common ancestor and then seeing how it branches out. Taking, for example, the finch. The finch branched out, you have this one particular common ancestor here, and based on where it lived, geographic distribution, some of them became insectivores and some of them became granivores. The ground finches were the ones that would be more of the seed eaters, things like that, small seeds, small berries, things of that nature. Then you had your more insectivores, the ones that would go after insects and things like that. And Galapagos, the series of islands that I've put here, all these series of islands of Galapagos just off the mainland of South America are very different. Topographically, they vary quite a bit. And even on one island, you could have some finches, like the ground finches, that would live on the bottom, and you would have some tree finches that would still live on the same island, but up on the top of the trees. So Darwin concluded that this is evidence that organisms could basically modify from a common ancestor because they need to adapt to their different environments. The other thing with geographic distribution is where he saw animals that would be unrelated, but because the locations of where they lived on different parts of the planet, but still the same, like for example, taking parts of the United States and parts of South America and being able to compare them. And there are parts of the US and parts of South America that are similar. They have the same environmental conditions. And so you could take certain organisms that would basically evolve with similar anatomies and similar behaviors, even though they're unrelated organisms, even though they're unrelated animals, but they evolve in the same way because of the similarities in their environment. Okay, that's also part of his natural selection as well. So Darwin basically concluded that these organisms would basically descend from different ancestors, but evolve in the same way. Again, proving that evolution could take, a very long time, and that evolution has been occurring for a very long time. He also talks about comparative anatomy, and we bring to light the comparison of completely, vastly different organisms, like demonstrated here in this illustration. We have our arm, we have the same appendage, if you will, for a horse, cat, bat, bird, whale. Now, needless to say, we would all agree that there are great differences between a human and a whale. But when you look at the anatomy of the two, we have homologous structures. If we have a homologous structure with a whale, which we do, and we have homologous structures with a horse and a cat and so forth, that would indicate that we have a common ancestor. And yet we're very different. Obviously, to go from the differences, anatomically speaking, between a whale and a human, it takes millions of years. It takes a great difference in environment. It takes a lot of things. And that's one of the things that Darwin was trying to prove. But we do have homologous structures. You look at the anatomy of the whale, and this is kind of comparable to our arm. Okay? And the same thing with our bird. We don't have wings. But inside the wing of a bird, it has this skeletal structure. And this skeletal structure, and I want you to take notice of the yellow, the white, and the brown part. Here you have our colorations in our parts, and the same thing applies in terms of what it does anatomically speaking in these other organisms. Okay, and in an upcoming picture, you're going to see this structure in a whale in terms of where it is. But homologous structures do indicate a common ancestor. And then when you look at the present day structure and anatomy of these organisms, you obviously can tell that it took a very long time to have those differences, get to where they are today. So, and I talked to you about the whale here, so here it is, as you can see right there. Now, in comparing the anatomy and seeing homologous structures, the similarities and differences in homologous structures help biologists basically put things into categories. When they are basically categorized similarly, we can also see similarities in function, similarities in the way that life kind of carries out for organisms. So structure and function both can be seen in that. And then we have vestigial structures. What happens when in one organism a homologous structure continues its purpose like normal, and in another organism it loses its purpose simply because throughout the course of the years one of the organisms have changed in different ways than the other one. Then comes the creation of vestigial structures. And so I bring to you, for example, the tailbone here. This bone here in the whale has become a vestigial structure. It no longer serves a purpose in this animal. But it does serve a purpose in other animals, like canine, felines, for example. So if there's a combination between two organisms, and one organism takes this kind of a structure, and another organism takes a different type of path, a different type of evolutionary path, one of the two could create, a vestigial structure. Our appendix, our tonsils, these are vestigial structures. We have similarities in other organisms, like, for example, other primates, like the gorilla. Okay, let's say. In the gorilla, the appendix is not necessarily a vestigial structure. But in us, it is. So therefore, why the difference? Well, simply because Darwin is trying to prove that because life basically changed somewhere millions of years ago between the two of us, these vestigial structures are basically created. Another thing that kind of shows a similarity between the two is the stage of the embryo. And in the stage of the embryo, you see here, for example, this is the embryo of a fish, this is the embryo of man. And if you really look at them, there aren't too many differences. Okay? Now, this picture here shows the embryos of these various animals that have similar backbones. Okay? So we have a similar backbone to, let's say, for example, this salamander here. Right? And in the embryo, there really aren't too many differences. But obviously, as you can see, once you go past the embryonic stage, life takes a turn. And so when life takes a turn, you're going to obviously take two completely different paths. The salamander is going to stay looking more like the salamander and take that lizard type form, and we grow as that man type form. But if you go back and look at the similarities in the embryo, that would be another indication that we developed from a common ancestor. DNA also can prove to us a common ancestor as well. Look at this chart, for example. These are the differences, the amino acid differences from the formation of human hemoglobin, the protein hemoglobin, the protein that we find in our blood. Now, there's only one there's only one amino acid difference between a human and a gorilla. Yet, when you look at a human and a gorilla, there are great differences between the two. Well, when you go down to the level of the DNA, to make this one particular protein, there's just one difference. So obviously, there has to be that would be another indication that there's a really good possibility that we derive from a common ancestor. All cells rely on DNA to make protein, right? They make those amino acid chains to eventually go through the primary, secondary, tertiary, and quaternary structure to make that protein. Well, if you're only going to find, say for example, considering that we're talking about millions, to find 27 differences between us and a mouse to make that one protein, that has to say, some kind of evidence that the sequence, there's 27 differences, means there has to be so many similarities that it allows scientists to basically infer that there are relationships between species of organisms that today we see vastly, vastly different. This concludes the second part, and then there'll be just one more third recording for evolution.